All right, gang, it is measurement day. I love measurement. You know why? Because it is a fundamental part of doing science. If you are interested in the construct of anxiety, you likely want to know how much anxiety a particular person has. Is it a lot or little? If you're interested in human memory, you want to know things like how many items can a person store in memory and how long can they hold them for? You have to measure those things. So knowing how to measure those things is critical to understanding the things themselves. Thus far in the course, we have talked about how the conclusions that we can draw from a particular study depend in part on the statistics that they use. And this is the level at which questionable research practices like p-hacking and harking can potentially affect the outcomes. But it goes deeper than statistics. There's another level down, and that's what we're going to tackle today. So let's start off by thinking about some of the things that psychologists typically want to measure. Okay, but when psychologists want to measure like psychological things, what do they want to measure? So many of the constructs that psychologists are interested in, like the things shown here, defy direct measurement, right? Like a measuring tape is great for height, but it's not great for, like personality, unless you're Mary Poppins. So psychologists try to get information about these underlying constructs by asking people to rate themselves on things, by observing people's behavior, by giving them tasks to do and evaluating how they do it, and so forth. And so usually there are multiple ways that we can measure any given construct. So for instance, if we're interested in depression, when we talk about depression, what it is and what causes it and how we treat it, we're talking about a conceptual variable or a latent construct. Constructs are these big, broad, descriptive mental abstractions. They're ways of describing phenomena of interest. So when we talk about resilience or loneliness or anxiety or perfectionism, these are all latent constructs. But if we want to study them in people, we need methods for operationalizing them or turning those constructs into numbers. So for instance, for depression, we can operationally define it as a score based on a clinician interview, or a rating based on a teacher evaluation, or self-reported symptom scores. But the scores on our measure, that's not what we're actually interested in. What we're interested in is depression. And so we care about the scores because we think that they tell us something about depression. So the key point here is that constructs are not variables. We want to understand constructs, but all we have access to are the variables that we've actually measured. So we're using the variables to get at the constructs, but we have to remember that they aren't the same thing. And it can be very easy to forget that constructs aren't variables because most of the claims that we hear from about psychology are about constructs, right? So we hear about things like stress and selfishness and screen time. And the way that these are described, they're talking about the constructs, even though what we've actually measured are variables. So let's take screen time as an example. This seems like a relatively simple thing to measure, right? Do people who spend more time on screens have worse mental health than people who spend less time? Okay, so how do you measure screen time? Well, one thing we could do is we could ask people to self-report, how many hours did you look at a screen today? Beep, 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 beep. How many did you look at it the next day? And have people fill it in on a day-by-day basis. We could also ask people to self-report the number of hours that they think they generally spend on their device. So if you think about the last 2 weeks, how much time a day do you think you spent on your device? We could also measure it by getting data from their phones and devices and actually logging the number of minutes that they spend looking at a screen every day. But we also have to think about whether or not we want to differentiate between time on a screen that's spent watching fascinating lectures where the people get to learn and grow and enrich their minds versus time spent doom scrolling the news or nurturing Instagram envy, right? We may think that those different kinds of screen time may lead to different outcomes. So those are all measurement choices, and the choices that we make can significantly affect the results of our studies. So what we're going to do today is unpack one particular construct and the ways in which it's been measured. You can think of this as kind of a case study for thinking about measurement more generally, and as an example of the kinds of measurement questions you can ask in comps. All right, so you know when you're in a crowded restaurant, I guess what I should actually say is, remember back when you could go to a crowded restaurant? Okay, you're in a crowded restaurant and there's someone that you want to talk to, but it's kind of hard to hear them because in order to understand what they're saying, you have to compete with all of this other background noise. And you can understand what they're saying, but it's hard, right? You have to kind of like squint your ears and your brain to strain to understand what they're saying. You know that feeling? Okay, well, that feeling describes the construct of listening effort. So in easy listening situations, it's possible to achieve high levels of word identification accuracy. That is, you can understand all of the words that somebody is saying, and you can do that at relatively low levels of effort. In our noisy restaurant situation, you may still be able to achieve high levels of accuracy, but it comes at the cost of greater effort. Now, if we were to only look at accuracy here, did you get 90% of the words right? Did you get 100% of the words right? If we only measured identification accuracy, these two situations are equivalent, right? You got all the words right. But that doesn't fully capture the listener's experience, right? You know, after you've been listening to someone in a noisy situation for a long time, you feel tired, you feel wiped out. It's like you've actually been exerting cognitive effort in order to overcome all of that noise. Okay, so I say accuracy is high, I say effort is low, I say effort is high. It's measurement day today, but actually every day. Don't just accept that I say something is high or low. Ask me, how do you measure it? Thank you. Okay, so first, how do we measure accuracy? Well, when we do research on word identification accuracy, we typically put participants in our lab, we have them wear headphones, and we play sentences or words to them, often with some kind of babbly background noise, and we say, what did you hear? They repeat something back, and then we score accuracy just based on the number of words they correctly identified. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, but what about measuring effort? How do we measure effort? Well, one way that people have measured effort in past research is just to ask somebody. Play some sentences, have some babbly background noise, and just say, how hard was that? How much effort did you have to exert? Did you have to work hard to understand what the person was saying? So in quiet and in noisy situations, the participants might be able to identify all the words, but in the background noise, they say they had to work harder to get there. There's other ways we can measure effort as well. We can also use physiological measures. So when you're exerting effort, whether it is physical or mental, your sympathetic response kicks in. This is your fight or flight response. This even works when you just add some background noise. We see some sympathetic nervous system activation when the noise is louder. And we can measure that using pupil size. So people's pupils get larger when there's more background noise and they're exerting more effort. We can also use measures like skin conductance and heart rate variability to measure effort as well. Okay, so we have self-report measures and we have physiological measures. But that's not all. We can also measure effort using behavioral tasks. So these rely on the assumption that humans have a limited cognitive capacity. There's only so much you can do at once. When more resources are used for one thing, fewer remain for other kinds of tasks. So more listening effort means fewer cognitive resources for things like encoding information into memory and responding to other tasks. So one way that we can measure effort is using recall-based measures. In these tasks, we present a bunch of words to participants, and then at some unexpected point, we stop and we say, what were the last several words you heard? And the assumption is that as participants have to expend more listening effort, fewer resources remain for encoding those words into memory. So more effort means they correctly recall fewer words. Okay, so we've got 3 ways of measuring effort so far. But wait, there's more. Another kind of behavioral measure is called a dual task measure. So in these situations, participants listen to speech while completing some secondary task. Push a button every time you see XYZ. Okay. Given the assumption that we have a limited pool of cognitive resources, as the speech task gets more difficult, performance should suffer on the secondary task. So as you're hearing words and asked to respond to them, for example, every time you hear a particular word or every time a word could be, let's say, a noun, participants get slower at responding to those words when they're exerting more effort. So you turn up the background noise, responses slow down. So these are 4 different classes of listening effort measures, but there are multiple different types of each of those classes. So how many unique measures of listening effort are there? How many? More than 24. I can't hear you gasping, but you're gasping, right? There's more than 24 ways to measure the same thing. So to put this into context, let's imagine that you are a researcher who is studying the construct of human height. You can use a ruler, you can use a measuring tape, you can use this piece of string I have that I wrote some lines on, or you can have a panel of judges estimate people's height. That's 4 things. And even among those 4 things, I bet you have opinions about which of those is going to be better at measuring human height and which is going to be more error prone. Okay, and now here we've got 24 measures that are all supposed to be measuring the same thing, listening effort. Okay, so how do we know if those 24 different measures are all testing the same thing? Well, one thing that we can do is have the same people take lots of these tests using the same materials and see if they render the same results. If they're all measuring the same thing, they should be highly intercorrelated with one another. So a couple of years ago, I did a study along with 5 Carleton student co-authors, and we ran over 100 Carleton students through 7 commonly used measures of listening effort. Actually, chances are, if you have done research in my lab, you may have been a participant in this study. Okay, so each of these represents one task that is commonly used to measure listening effort. You can see on the left side, those are the categories that I described earlier. So this is a correlation matrix, so it's just showing the strength of the correlations among different measures. Remember that a correlation of 1 means the tasks are perfectly correlated with one another, they predict each other perfectly, and a correlation of 0 means they're totally unrelated. So the question is simply, does performance on one task predict performance on another? If these tasks were all measuring the same thing, they should have really strong intercorrelations. So here's some numbers. What you might notice is there are some positive, significant correlations indicating that the effort associated with listening to speech as measured by one task predicts the effort associated with listening to speech as measured by another task. However, the vast majority of the correlations were very small and not statistically significant. The average correlation was across all of the tasks was 0.2, which is not statistically significant. So we have 24 different tests, 24 different listening effort tests, and they all have the same name. They all think that they are measures of listening effort, but in fact, they're not measuring the same thing because they're not intercorrelated with one another. So they can't possibly all be measuring the same thing. So it appears that we have in the listening effort literature what Thorndike referred to as the jingle fallacy. Falsely assuming that multiple tasks that are called listening effort tasks are in fact measuring the same thing. Just because 2 tasks have the same name doesn't mean they're measuring the same thing. It's kind of a dirty secret in measurement, but you can just name a task anything you want. I've got a string with some marks on it. I could call it height. Maybe I'll just wrap it around your head and call it emotional intelligence, right? You can call a task anything you want. That doesn't mean it's actually measuring that. Okay, so in this study, we also measured a bunch of other cognitive variables. So we tested people's memory and their processing speed and their inhibitory control and a bunch of things that are supposed to be different from listening effort. So now we've got the listening effort measures along the left and the cognitive measures along the top. This again shows the correlations between the effort measures on the left and the cognitive measures on the top. So again, there's a lot of variability, but you will notice that some of these correlations are quite strong. Stronger, in fact, than the correlations among measures of listening effort. So in some cases, we see stronger correlations between tasks that are supposed to be measuring different things than we see between tasks that are supposed to be measuring the same thing. I missed the gasping. You're gasping, right? If you want to record yourself gasping and send it to me, maybe I'll put in a gasping sound effect here. Whatever, but I'm going to say this again. Okay, in some cases, we see stronger correlations between tasks that are supposed to be measuring different things than the correlations between tasks that are supposed to be measuring the same thing.
No way.
That is cause for some concern, to put it lightly. So in addition to the jingle fallacy, it also suggests that there's some evidence for what Kelly called the jangle fallacy, the false notion that different tasks must be measuring different things because they have different names. In this case, we have a task that is called a working memory task and a task that's called a listening effort task. And in fact, they're very highly correlated with one another. Those tasks have different names, but they're measuring a lot of the same thing. Now, the idea of jingle and jangle are not new. Check out the dates on those citations. But they've been they have found renewed attention because of their potential to affect issues of replicability and generalizability. So to help demonstrate how these fallacies can complicate the literature, check this out. There are decidedly conflicting results about how seeing the face of a talker affects listening effort. So I can present speech in which you both see and hear the talker, just like this, what's happening right now, or in a situation where you have to rely solely on the auditory signal and you can't see the talker's face. Now, we know from prior work that seeing the talker helps a lot with word recognition. Seeing moving faces lets you identify many more words correctly. This is why it's so much harder, one of the reasons that it's so much harder to understand speech when someone's wearing a mask, right? You can't see their mouth moving. But how does seeing the face of a talker affect effort? Well, the literature is decidedly mixed. Some studies suggest that seeing a talker's face increases listening effort. Some studies show that it decreases listening effort. Some studies show that it doesn't matter. And some studies show that it depends on what kind of noise is present and how loud that noise is. So you could call these failures to replicate. But when my students and I noticed this pattern in the literature and started to dig deeper, we realized that the studies that had shown conflicting results had actually used different tasks to measure listening effort. So the studies that showed that seeing a face increases effort, those tended to be dual task measures. The ones that decrease effort, those tend to be recall tasks. Those that have no effect, it's a different kind of recall task. And if it depends, that's yet a different kind of behavioral task. So maybe these results aren't actually conflicting with one another. Maybe these aren't failures to replicate at all. Maybe seeing a face hurts whatever dual task measures measure, and it helps whatever the running memory recall task measures, and it doesn't have any effect on the other ones, and so forth. So thinking carefully about measurement is really fundamental to understanding replication. I'd also say at this point that identifying this pattern in the literature is an example of a topic that would make a beautiful comps, right? You look at a bunch of findings that seem to be conflicting, you do a careful deep dive into exactly how, into the methods of those studies and how they were conducted, and you find that depending on the measure you use, you get different results. That would be a lovely comps project. Okay, so the key takeaway points here are that constructs are not the same as variables. We care about constructs, but all we have access to are the variables that we measure. And we can measure them in multiple ways. You may think of this as kind of another instantiation of researcher degrees of freedom. We have a lot of flexibility in how we measure things. And thinking carefully about measurement is fundamental to understanding replication. So from now on, a lot of times when we talk about research, you may say something like, oh, this study showed that anxiety was higher among, and I'm going to say something like, anxiety, huh? But how did they measure it? Anytime I say a construct, you're free to say, but Julia, but how did they measure it? Because thinking about measurement is absolutely fundamental to understanding the constructs that we're interested in. So in a couple of class periods, we're going to talk about how specifically we evaluate whether our variables are representing the construct that we're actually interested in. And we're going to talk more about how we know which instruments to trust. So this is kind of a teaser to get you thinking about measurement. So as you're working on the first sections of your comps papers, and as you're reading the previous literature, you can be thinking about the measurement choices that those researchers are making. All right, remember to post on Slack, and I will see you in class.